This evening I want to talk to you about worry. This is something that I think touches every single one of us. I don't know that there is a single person on earth that does not experience worry in their life. And Bob, as we had the scripture reading this evening, he read from Matthew chapter 6, and I want you to turn over there to Matthew chapter 6. We'll be spending a lot of time there. We will turn to some other passages. But we want to talk about worry tonight, and we want to talk about what God's solution for worry is. Now, I want to have this side note at the beginning and kind of get this out of the way at the beginning. When I'm talking about worry, I'm not talking about anxiety disorders. I'm not talking about chemical processes in your brain that you really can't control and maybe should be on medication for. Mental illness is definitely real, and there are people who deal with anxiety and worry as part of mental illness. That's not what we're talking about tonight. What we're talking about tonight is the type of worry that we can control, and the type of worry that really comes from our own small thinking, I guess you could say. And that's what we're talking about tonight. But I wanted to just kind of get that out of the way from the get-go here. So Jesus in Matthew chapter 26 gives us the prescription for worry, and we're not going to read over it again, but rather we're going to kind of go verse by verse and talk about what Jesus' solution for worry is. The first thing that Jesus tells us is in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 25. He tells us that life is more than the physical. Jesus says, "For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing?" Jesus says there's more to life than the physical. Now, he's specifically talking about your basic needs here, about food and clothing, but really, what part of life does this not reach to in some way? If you're worried about not having a job, maybe you're not necessarily worried about having clothing or having food on the table, but you are worried about having steady income. This would apply, right? Is not life more than food and clothing? Maybe you're worried about a relationship that you have with someone that is not really going the way that it should, and you're worried about how to deal with that. Well, this would also apply. And so you understand that this principle applies more to than just basic needs. It really applies to all facets of life. Life is more than the physical. And we get bogged down in the physical quite a bit because we are indeed physical beings, but we've been called to look beyond that and look toward the spiritual. And so we are called to keep our mind focused on the things of utmost importance. And we'll come back to that thought later on. But the second thing that Jesus says is, God will take care of you. In verse 26, he says, "Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they?" And then skipping down to verse 28, he says, "And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor they spin. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown in the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith?" The solution for worry includes the idea that God is going to take care of us. Whatever we think that we need, whatever we think that is best for us, God knows more and so much more what we need and what is best for us, and He will take care of us. Jesus gives us two examples from nature here. He gives us the birds of the air, and He talks about the lilies of the field. And God takes care of them both. God sees to their needs. And Jesus says, how much more worth are you than they? Think about Genesis chapter 1, when God created the heavens and the earth. And He kept looking at creation. And as He created the land and skies and seas, sun and moon and stars and the animals and all that, it was good. But when He finally looked upon creation, when man was made, man who He said, let us make in our image, He said, it is very good. Creation was very good. You think about Psalm 8, where it says, when we look at God and we look at the stars of heaven, what is man that you think of him? God has made us a little lower than the angels. He's given us dominion over the earth. God cares about us a lot, as evidenced by our positioning in this world and this universe. God sent His Son to die on the cross for our sins. So how much does that say about how God thinks of us? God is going to take care of us. And whatever we're worried about, whatever we're thinking about, we need to understand that if it's a true need, if it's truly something that we need, God is going to take care of that. Notice what Jesus says at the end of verse 30. He says, you of little faith. We need to understand that worry comes from lack of faith. It comes from this idea that I've got to take care of things, or maybe even that there are certain things that are out of my control, and I'm stressing out over that. And we fail to realize that God is in control of the entire universe, that He knows about our little problems, and is willing to take care of us too. And if we would just remember that God is going to take care of us, and we would trust that and believe that, then worry would not be a problem. Paul says essentially the same thing over in Philippians chapter 4. You'll turn over there, Philippians chapter 4. In verse 6, Paul says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. If I've got something I'm worried about, even if it's something beyond my control, and I don't know how it's going to turn out, and it could turn out to be unpleasant, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to sit on it and chew on it in my own mind? Or am I going to give it up to God? Am I going to, in everything, by prayer and supplications, with thanksgiving, let my requests be made known to God? If we would stop worrying and just give things over to God and tell Him about our troubles and our problems and let Him deal with things, we'd have a lot less to worry about. And that brings me to my next point. Worry doesn't do any good. Turn back over to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, verse 27, Jesus says, and who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? Do you know of anybody who has ever gained anything from worry? I can't say that I do or I have. I found this quote, but I wasn't able to find the author. They said, worry is like a rocking chair. It'll give you something to do, but it won't get you anywhere. That's true. We can sit and stew on things in our minds, and we can mull them over, and we can lose sleep over things. But what is that going to accomplish? How is it going to help solve the problem? It's not. And so when we find ourselves worried, we need to remember that it's not doing us any good. And so we need to put that out of our mind. In verse 33, Jesus gives us perhaps the most important thing to remember about worry, is that we need to have our priorities straight. Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, but seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. All these things is referring back to food and drink and clothing, the necessities of life. And Jesus says, if you have your priorities straight, if you're seeking first God, His kingdom, and His righteousness, then everything else is going to fall into place. And as humans, we're really good at getting the cart before the horse. We're really good about getting priorities flipped upside down. And we're really good also at turning mountains into molehills. Is that enough phrases for you? Illustrations? The point is that we make things bigger than they need to be. We place things as more important than they need to be. And we forget that our primary purpose in this life is to serve God, to seek Him first and His righteousness, and keep His commandments. If we do these things, then the other things are going to work themselves out. In part because that's how God made the world, so that if we live righteously, then we're going to be taken care of, but also because God is actively intervening on our part. As we talked about in point 2, God will take care of us. Paul says essentially the same thing over in Colossians. As he's speaking to the church at Colossae, he says in chapter 3 and verse 1, Colossians chapter 3 and verse 1, therefore if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with Him in glory. Remember how I said that life is more than physical? Life does not consist of physical things and physical possessions. Well, that's what Paul's saying here. Don't worry about the things that are on the earth. That's not where your mind should be. You should set your mind on things above. You should set your mind on things heavenly, things that are eternal. And if you seek those things and set your mind on those things, that's what you're supposed to be doing. And that's going to help you with so many things as well, as Paul goes on to talk about how it helps us with our conduct and helps us with our relationships to other people, and so on and so forth. So put God first in your life. But Jesus closes out Matthew chapter 6 with another important thing, another important point to keep in mind. In verse 34, he says, so do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. A lot of times when we're worried, it's about things that haven't happened yet. It's about things that could possibly happen, maybe even likely will happen, but things that are yet in the future. It was Mark Twain who said, I've known many troubles in my life, and most of them have never happened. I can empathize with that. We can wear ourselves down quick thinking about tomorrow. thinking about, well, what's going to happen if this happens? And what's going to happen if this happens? And I don't know how I'm going to deal with this. And no, that's not to say that we shouldn't have careful planning and be godly and good stewards and things like that. But we need to recognize that all we have is today. Today, we have control of. Tomorrow, not so much. And then again, how much of today do we really control? We need to be focused on the things that we can control. And tomorrow is definitely not one of them. Turn over to James chapter 4. James chapter 4. Starting in verse 13, James says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit, yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that." Now, James is not dealing with a worried person here. He's actually dealing with perhaps the opposite problem. Whereas a worried person is doubting and kind of unsure, this person is boasting and prideful and says, tomorrow we're going to do this and that. But you know what they have in common? Whether you're boasting about tomorrow, whether you're worried about tomorrow, you're not thinking about what you should be thinking about. And James says it. Verse 14, "Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away." You don't know, but what you ought to be thinking about is found in verse 15. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. The worried person and the prideful person both fail to take into account what God wants and what God's plan is. We have right now in the present, we don't know if God's going to give us tomorrow. And so we need to be living in the present. And by the way, this also refers to not just thinking about tomorrow, but how often do we also worry about yesterday? We think about the things that we have done. And again, I'm not, there are certain principles that kind of have to balance this out. I'm not talking about regret. I'm not talking about godly sorrow. I'm not talking about repentance. Those things, yes. But sometimes we just worry. Sometimes we just get anxious about how we used to be. And sometimes we can even worry about past sins that we've repented of, that we've confessed, that God has told us that He's gracious to forgive and forget. And yet we just keep on holding on to them. That's just as dangerous, if not more, than worrying about tomorrow. We got to live one day at a time. Turn over to Philippians chapter 3. I don't have this up on the slide, but I debated on whether or not I put it in. I guess so you have my decision. Philippians chapter 3, verse 13, Paul says, "Brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Let us therefore, as many as are perfect, have this attitude. And if in anything you have a different attitude, God will reveal that also to you. However, let us keep living by the same standard to which we have attained. Let me ask you this. Do you think Paul had things from his past that haunted him? That caused him to dwell and linger? Absolutely. And sometimes he brings that up. He tells Timothy that God has come to, Christ Jesus died to save sinners, among whom I am chief. He says, I was formerly a persecutor and a blasphemer, and yet Jesus showed me grace. But Paul's bringing that up wasn't to linger on that and have a pity party and to worry and wallow in that. He was emphasizing the grace that Jesus had shown him and continues to show him. So yeah, Paul had things to worry about. Paul had demons from his past. But he says, I forget what lies behind. Not only did Paul have things from his past that, he did, but also Paul was mistreated a lot. And if you've ever been mistreated, if you've ever been dealt harshly with by someone and they just didn't treat you the way that they should, you know that that's hard to get over. You know that kind of keeps replaying in your mind over and over again. And Paul says, forgetting what lies behind and looking forward to what lies ahead. But also, Paul, when he says looking forward to what lies ahead, he's not saying that I'm worried about tomorrow. He's talking about the goal ahead. He's talking about doing work for Jesus. And do you think Paul had things that he was worried about? Think about for the 2 years that he was sitting in prison waiting to go to Rome. Or waiting to get out, and eventually he appealed to Caesar in order to get to Rome. But for 2 years he was kind of stuck in this state of, well, what's going to happen to me? When am I going to get out? I need to be preaching the gospel. You think Paul could have succumbed to worry? Or when he's in Rome, in prison in Rome. He tells the Philippians, I'm not sure whether I'm going to get out or whether this, I could be put to death. I'm not sure. That could have caused him to worry. And yet in the same letter, he says in chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, as we read, don't be anxious. Don't be anxious for anything, but let your request be made known to God. Paul had things from both his past and possibly looking into his future that could have caused him a lot of worry. Could have caused him a lot of anxiety. But he chose to give that all up and look to Jesus. Focus on living one day at a time. He told the Philippians that if he's granted release, if God allows him to stay on this earth, he's going to continue working. And that's the same kind of attitude that we should have ourselves. So as we close this evening, I want you to look at Jesus' solution for worry. When you're worried, when you're anxious, look at these things. Whether you remember them by looking at the Bible verses or whether you write this down and keep it in a notebook, but keep in mind these reminders. When you're worried, life is more than the physical. What you're worried about in the grand scheme of things might not matter as much as you think it does. But even if it does, understand that God is going to take care of you. God wants what's best for you, and you need to trust that. Also, worry does no good. You're not accomplishing anything, so just stop it. Stop worrying and put God first. Worry about following Him. And the other things are going to fall into place. And live one day at a time. See how you can serve God today. And let tomorrow have its own trouble. As we close, and as we've been thinking about worry, there is one thing that you should worry about. And that is your salvation. Specifically, if you know that you're not in a right relationship with Christ, and you also realize that as you go to bed tonight, you might not wake up, Jesus could come back, that thought should worry you. But again, as we pointed out, worry itself does no good. But worry can be a call to action. And it should worry you if you don't have a right relationship with Christ. But the good news is, you don't have to be worried about it. You can do something about it. In a moment, as we sing the invitation song, if you have not given your life to Jesus Christ, that opportunity is available. If you are a Christian, but perhaps you have not lived as Christ would want you to live, there's sin in your life, or perhaps you're just struggling and need encouragement, that opportunity is available for you. But understand this, even if you're worried about your salvation, if you're in Christ Jesus and you're following Him, there's no need for worry. There is confidence and security and peace in Him. So if you'd like some of that, won't you come while we stand and sing?